Hey guys, my name is Bobby Wood, and this is Eric Sitterud, and we are two pastors of Redemption Church. I pastor in Redemption Church in Ogden, Utah, and Eric pastors in Redemption Church in North Ogden, Utah. And this is the Redemption Roundtable, and today we are going to talk about something very spicy. We're going to talk about immigration, ICE, and the current controversies that are happening in our country today. And we like to delve into the difficult issues at Redemption Roundtable. We realize these issues are polarizing, and there's a lot of people who feel very, very strongly about these particular issues. And so there's always a danger, I think, when you jump into an issue like this, because you're afraid of hurting someone's feelings or making someone angry that you care about and you love deeply. But we want to dive into those difficult subjects, and this is one where we really want to approach. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot in our country related to two specific shootings. Where at ICE protest, both Renee Good was shot after she was attempting to, depends on how you see it, potentially attack an ICE officer or flee from the scene. And then you also have a guy named Alex Peretti, where he was also shot, who had a firearm on him. ICE agents said he attempted to pull out his gun, and the ICE agents fired in protection. But those who have watched the video online or whatever have said he was disarmed before he had a chance to even pull his gun, and was fired, and it was shot in cold blood. We're going to talk through some of those things. How should Christians respond? How should maybe we not respond? But just so you guys know, like, we're not experts on this particular topic. I'm not an immigration lawyer. I can't speak to government policy in the same way that, somebody who's spent a lot of time, who's delved in deep into every jot and tittle of the law. We're just two dudes who love Jesus and want to shepherd our church as well, and including those that have deep, deep questions about these particular issues. Eric, what do you think, man? Opening remarks here?
Yeah, I think it's at the point where there are things that happen in the country that we live in, and as a pastor, though, there are people that are paying attention, and people have emotions about this. People are passionate about some of these things, and they take one side or the other. And so we would like to offer an honest conversation about where we are, right? I know that oftentimes people should and want to, and it's a good thing to look to their spiritual leaders for advice or biblical counsel on how to view politics and view what's going on in our world through a biblical lens. And so that's really what we want to do is offer that to our people. So I think that's where we should start. And again, I'll throw it back to you, Bobby. Let's talk about where this all starts with immigration and having borders and border control. Is it right biblically for America to have immigration laws and policies, or to have borders? Should we just have open borders? What does the Bible say about this?
Yeah, man, I think it's a great question. And again, I think when we talk about specifically the government's role and what does the Bible see as a government's role, there's a few passages, especially in the New Testament, that help us to understand, I think, as Christians in the New Covenant, and how we are to respond to government. A big one that comes to my mind is Romans chapter 13. So Romans chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God. attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. I think what we see here is that God makes a clear distinction of the role of government, that the role of government has been created and instituted to keep the peace, to have a nation that's just, that punishes wrongdoers and criminals in society, and that there is a punishment as a result of crimes that are committed, that we have jails and prisons where we imprison people who shouldn't be on the streets, and that they have at least a place where they can be rehabilitated at the very least, but they are no longer in a place where they can cause harm to society. This is the government's role. Now, this looks very different from government to government. We see that, obviously in Paul's writing to the church in Rome, you have the Roman government, and the Roman government is a very powerful government, and a government that rules with an iron fist. We see in Rome itself, Rome had a lot of good things that Rome did to protect the order of society, but Rome also had a lot of terrible things that Rome did. Rome persecuted Christians from time to time. Rome had the worship of the emperor as something that was mandated to people in society. And so that brings up the other question, and this is really the question people ask when it comes to a passage like Romans 13, is like, well, when should we resist the government? And when is it okay to resist the government? Because there have been really, really evil governments throughout history, and we've seen some that are even still around today. And there are times when it's appropriate and right to civilly disobey your government authorities and leaders. But what we see in Romans chapter 13 is that the general rule should be, if at all possible, obey your government, follow your leaders, give honor to whom honor is due, respect to whom respect is due, pay your taxes. I mean, I think about just in the taxes issue alone, I hate paying taxes every year. And that time comes around, I just loathe it. I kind of wish we could change tax law and I had the authority to remove taxes, at least for my own personal taxes, because I hate paying them. But I pay my taxes because I believe Romans 13 is pretty clear on that. There are times when Christians are told you can't worship God and you can't freely assemble as a church. I think those laws should be civilly disobeyed. I remember during COVID, I hated wearing a mask on airplanes. I thought it was the dumbest thing ever. Maybe it protected people, maybe it didn't, whatever, but I hated wearing it. And I wish that law could have been taken away and the flight attendant came by and made sure all the time I had my mask on. And it was I felt personally like it was a dumb thing to do, but I did it. And I did because it was the rule, it was the law. Now, is it a right law? Is it a good law? Is it a bad law? Those things can be debated. Of course, I have my opinions, and you probably do too. But as best as we can, we should live peaceably with our government, and we should live as lawfully as we possibly can. What's your thoughts about that, man?
Yeah, when you went to Romans 13 and that God has given the government or the civil magistrate authority to govern its people with laws, and ultimately, yes, it's supposed to be for punishing evil and rewarding good. And I was reading in Isaiah today, to the nation of Israel. At one point, he rebukes them because they were calling evil good and good evil, and they got things backwards. And we see that in our government. They get things backwards. They call things that we know that are morally evil, like abortion or gay marriage, things like this, calling it good when it's evil. We don't have to obey that. We don't have to support that. And then, Acts 5 would be the greatest example of disobeying, as you said, when Peter and the other apostles were told not to speak in the name of the Lord Jesus to preach the gospel. And they said, we must obey God rather than men. And they went on and did it. And hopefully that's what we will do and teach our people to do in those times. Yeah, there's a lot of other things we could debate about. You brought up masks and vaccines and all of that type of stuff, where I think we can personally have a conscience decision about those things. but particularly when we get to this thing today, about having borders and laws concerning immigration and things like that. I think that we can say, I'll just say it right out, that if we've made it a law for there to be a proper way to come in and to assimilate into the country, and people go against that, so that's called illegal immigration. If people are illegally immigrating into the country, not wanting to do it the way in which the law of the land is, then that is wrong. It's wrong in God's eyes. We could call that even a sin, because they're going against the government in which God set up. And many of us can just use common sense and say that it's good. In the Bible, there are borders. There were borders to Israel. There are walls, that in the book of Nehemiah are being rebuilt, and that just common sense says that borders are a good thing to have, so that the extent of where your land goes, and then to have protection at those borders, so that just not anybody, any terrorist, any threat can come in. They've got to be vetted and investigated to see why are they coming in, right? And so now there's a lot of other things in Scripture about how to treat the foreigner, treat the sojourner, treat the immigrant. And we see many instances in that, and I think we'll get to that. But I think first off, we can say that the laws about immigration, while I'm not an expert, make a lot of common sense to me. They make sense that not anybody should just be allowed to cross any border they want in all the world. That would cause a lot of security risks for everyone. We look at countries all over the world, and they have even stricter border laws than we do here in America. I mean, a lot less migration or immigration is happening in other countries than it does here. We did establish this country with the grace of God and the wisdom of God, and we did want it to be a place for freedom, for religious freedom, for things like that. And so why not try to do it the right way, which then kind of takes us to, when people
Well, I
do
would
it the
say,
wrong way, how do we deal with them, right? Yeah.
before you jump into that, I think and you made a distinction here, and I think it's good we clarify this. So if you're listening, you just kind of hang on, because right now we're just talking about what's the government's role and responsibility, and I think there's another side to this, like what's the church's responsibility. And so what we're saying right now is that the government has a responsibility to provide order, security, and justice for its citizenry. So borders is one way in which you do that. And again, you talked about, Eric, even in the Old Testament or just throughout history, what do nations do? They protect their borders. Borders were a place of dispute. Borders were where land was taken. Foreign armies would invade your border. And so you had to protect the border so that other nations could not just come into your country and raid and pillage, your towns and communities. And so the government's responsibility, there was a social contract, the citizenship, where they had with the government in order to protect their borders so that they could protect their country. That's kind of what we're saying, I think, is that borders are a good thing. And that means also that there should be a vetting of who comes in the country. That is a natural part of protecting and defending the border, is that there should be a vetting. So it's a good for society. It's a good for the government. It's a good for the flourishing of humankind that there is a protection of our borders. And I think, like what you said there with the church side of it, we're going to hit that one at the end. If you're listening, just hang on. And we will ask, and I think this is really the question a lot of people are asking, which we'll get to, is it morally right to do what we're doing as a country, or are there things that are happening that are wrong or incorrect? And so we want to walk through some of that as well. But just to start off with, I think we do need to have a foundation of, is immigration law good? Yes, every country has it. It'd be foolish to say we should just have an open border and allow whoever and everyone to come through. I think we would agree with that. And so the second part of that would then be, okay, like what do we see now happening in the streets in America? Minneapolis is seemingly on fire. You know, every time I turn on the news, it seems like there's another protest in Minneapolis. You have, on top of that, tied into that, Nick Shirley, podcaster, YouTuber, influencer, you know, uncovered, you know, these billions of dollars that are going to fund Somali daycares, and there's no kids in these daycares. And so you have that on top of it, Minneapolis. So we have all this political upheaval and turmoil in Minneapolis right now being the main target. But this has happened in Newark, New York City, LA, all over the country, in Texas, everywhere. And so, like, talking about the way in which we do it, what have you seen, man? What's been your thoughts as you've watched stuff on the news?
You know, I think that sadly, the way in which people have learned to express their ideas and opinions or to try to bring about change is through some kind of, you know, radical action. And I think we've seen it through some of his former leaders. I believe I saw Obama say something about this, about get out there and don't be quiet. You know, kind of people encouraging these protests, in which protests are legally fine. They're okay. Like, honestly,
First
we have
Amendment.
freedom of speech in this country, right? So, and I'm a Protestant, and so, you know, we've been protesting longer than any protester ever has, you know, over the the teachings of the Catholic Church. But yeah, there's a right and a wrong way to do it, first of all. And I think, but if I just step back a little bit and try to analyze, like, this is how the powers that be in the minds that are thinking about how they want to bring about change, or how they want to change the position of the power between the left and the right. Like, let's incite some you know, some big issues, and spotlight them and get all the news to focus on it, so that we can tip the scales the other direction, or for or against whatever party. That's what I see. That's my opinion. But so I think that this has been highly emotionalized, kind of over talked about, overlooked at by the news. And then, you know, you mentioned, I think you mentioned this earlier on, but all these videos that are popping up about those shootings that happened. I keep seeing different angles of these shootings, and some of them are adding new things. Like, I saw one recently where it looked like the gun was taken and then a shot was fired, and they showed like a blast coming out of the barrel and hitting the ground, and none of the other videos showed that. And I'm like, this has got to be AI, right? This has got to be somebody added that in there. And but people are taking this and just spreading it all over the internet. And sadly, and this is probably going to get me in trouble, but we have our boomer and our X generation that has relied heavily on the news and news outlets. And so people are kind of conditioned to see the first thing that they believe, or at least have an emotional reaction to it, right? Like, you have an emotional reaction to something that seems so terrible or gruesome, and that's what this is all designed to do. I mean, that is what the media is trying to do, and they've been using the media propaganda to try to sway people's opinions and, you know, mind control for a long time. We need to understand that. So coming into this with knowing that, you know, we should be a little bit more conservative or protective of giving our full trust to everything we hear and see about what's going on. That's my mindset, is when I see things on the news. I don't watch the news a lot in the first place. When I see little clips or shorts or things like that on Facebook, my first reaction is, I'm not going to believe it. I'm going to do a lot more research. That's what I would say. First of all, that's what we should do. That would be my pastoral exhortation right now, is like, let's slow down when things happen before we want to get react emotionally to it. I know that that's a natural reaction that is programmed into us to have that, but that's what came up when you were talking about that. So I don't know. Do you have something to add to that?
So the big question I think that we've seen on the news, and you mentioned it, Eric, about talking about AI and all these different camera angles is, one thing about the news is we have this instant access because of X or Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. There's also now you mentioned the legacy media, which it seems like there's definitely is often one-sided. And I think as we look at news today and trying to figure out what we can trust or not trust, it is very difficult to know what actually happened in the situation. And I think sometimes the danger of having so much media at our fingertips is it gives us the illusion that we actually have knowledge. And I think the opposite side of that is that it can give us false knowledge, that you're talking about with fake news and AI. But I think we should have this approach with whatever we do and whatever we see. But we are so quick to make a judgment about in a situation that's happened. So let's take the two situations. Renee Good, again, she was in her vehicle and ICE agents had asked her to stop. She did not stop. She backs up and then drives forward. An ICE agent is kind of at the front / corner of her vehicle. She's kind of turning the wheel. The ICE agent makes a split-second decision, and he fires at her and kills her. Obviously, nobody wants to see somebody die. Bad situation. And you have a lot of people who are very upset that Renee Good was shot. They said she was shot in cold blood. And then you have a lot of people who would say ICE did the right thing. It was a good shoot. His life was threatened. He didn't know her intention. He made a split-second decision, and he shot her out of the protection of his life. The other situation was Alex Peretti. Alex Peretti he had a camera out. He's filming. He's also supposedly, and again, I'm just reading all this from the internet, just like we all are, is a legal Second Amendment concealed carry holder. He's holding, I think it's a SIG P320, and he has this on him. And as he is helping some lady who got pushed down, he kind of interferes with the ICE agents and gets in the middle of it. Well, I don't know exactly what happened, and that's where I stand. Is I don't know exactly what happened, but he's alleged to have gone to grab his gun, and when he went to grab his gun, pull it out, he was shot by the ICE agents. I think he was fired maybe 8 or 10 times, and he died. Those who watch the video say it doesn't look like he pulled his gun. In fact, they say you can see a guy who disarms him. He takes the gun away, and then he's shot. I've looked at that camera angle, and I mean, it's like you're far away. You're seeing the back of ICE agents, and you can zoom in and see these fuzzy pictures. But to me, it's not super clear exactly what happened. It looks a certain way, and I definitely could make judgments on that. But I just don't know. I wasn't there. I do know Homeland Security is going to open up an investigation on that. I think Congress is already looking into it. The House Judiciary Committee is looking into it. I think you have the state of Minnesota looking into it. We're going to have people who are going to be investigating this for a long time. Can we just say, maybe as Christians, we should just reserve judgment for a second? And if this guy was shot in cold blood, those ICE agents need to be dealt with in the way in which that is right and just. But let's just say Alex Peretti maybe did try to harm them in some way. And maybe there's a detail here that we don't know. All I'm saying is before we make judgment and we are judge, jury, executioner, let's just wait and see what the evidence actually shows. I think one of the things that I've learned from just talking with friends who are in law enforcement, and this is something I think we miss with our armchair quarterbacks, who are watching Twitter videos and making judgments. Police officers put themselves on the line every single day when they leave their home in the morning. They don't know if today's the day and that they hit their fateful day and they come across a situation which they end their life. They lose their life. Their wife, their kids don't know if their dad's going to be coming home that day. And these guys have to make split-second decisions on life or death matters. And can we just say for a second, that's a really hard thing to do? And maybe that there's a lot of people who want to hurt those ICE agents, and we should maybe just reserve judgment a little bit. Like I said, if they're in trouble, they did something wrong, they should be punished. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I just think like we are so quick to make judgments on things we just don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the sense of we have no idea what really happened there.
Yeah. That was what I was saying earlier is yeah, I think we need to slow down. Now, after you brought all that up, going back looking at Romans 13 a little bit, I would just say that there is a lack of respect and fear for law enforcement. It does say, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is good, and you will receive his approval? Like, would we say... Now, the argument is that they were acting within their rights to stop and protest or to get involved the way that they did. But my opinion is that both people lacked any kind of, I guess, fear for law enforcement. In fact, it just seems like more like disdain. I have friends who are police officers, and I know that in the first case, that vehicles can be used to inflict harm. In fact, there's been, many instances of a similar instance where somebody really was trying to inflict harm on the officer, and they have to do what they have to do. That's why it says again, he bears the sword. What's a sword? It's for justice, judgment, self-defense. Could you say that the modern day sword of this authority that's being talked about, some of it application could be in the single law enforcement officer who carries? I would say that applies. That's a practical application to this. He's a branch of the government. So again, if you think about common sense, I don't think it's wise to put yourself that close to a stressful incident or to be the one causing it, thinking that there's no danger. There needs to be respect. There needs to be respect when things like, again, you said that these guys, they have stressful jobs. Their family makes a sacrifice wondering if, this will be the day that their father or mother doesn't come home again. And I just think we should just have respect for law enforcement in our country. I think that's also biblical here as far as Romans 13 goes. And
I think to say though, but dude, like if Alex Preddy was not trying to pull a firearm out and he was shot, unjustly, I think those ICE agents should be dealt with appropriately. And I think every good law enforcement officer I've ever talked to would have the same view, but to your point, like these are really, really difficult, crazy situations. While I do believe there's like lawful protests that happen and many lawful protesters, these are just some of the things that have happened. For example, in LA, November of last year, 10 protesters were violent towards officers and property. Arrest followed. In Minneapolis, we've seen protesters obstructing vehicles, roadways, interfering with ICE agents. in the middle of their duties. We saw that there was graffiti, property damage, attempts to breach a lobby, and injuries to other police officers and agents. At an immigration facility in Texas last year, shots were fired at ICE officers and the facilities. In Newark, protesters were assaulting federal officers. June 25, bottles were thrown by protesters at NYPD officers, and street obstacles were thrown at them as well. In July 25, Prairieland ICE facility in Texas, protesters set off fireworks, vandalized vehicle structures, and shot an officer in the neck. So this is something like, this is not, those aren't peaceful protests. While there are peaceful protesters, and I'm not labeling all anti-ICE protesters as violent protesters, there are many who are operating peaceful protests that are expressing their views, and they were within their legal rights, constitutional rights, in order to protest. And I think they should have those legal constitutional rights to protest peacefully. But when you get into the place of obstructing officers, and officers aren't sure if you are going to try to take their life, or you're just somebody who's yelling at them and running in front of their vehicle, or you're pulling a cell phone out of your pocket to film and not a Glock to shoot them, like, they're making quick decisions and split level decisions. And I think we need to say, like, there just needs to be some grace for those officers, because those officers have a lot of stress in their mind, their plates, and the situation is very upsetting and violent. And I mean, if we were in that situation, if I'm in that situation, all I'm thinking about is like, man, am I going to be able to protect myself, these other men and women around me, from a violent mob? Is this the day the violent mob turns crazy and wants to hurt everybody? There's just so much that happens. And so we've seen protesters who have not acted in peaceful protest and have gone beyond their First Amendment rights, in my view, to a criminal way of obstructing justice. And that's where, to me, that's where the rubber hits the road with some of these things. And yeah, like, these types of incidents are going to happen because the job of the government is to provide order. And in these cities, Minneapolis being one, we are not seeing order.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of the different opinions that I've seen online, and how, there's not as much emphasis on other presidents, deportations and immigration, and how ICE worked. In fact, it was said that under Obama, actually more people were deported than under Trump's administration. And people like CNN and all these, they were doing ride-alongs with with ICE and stuff like that. And now they've been kind of turned into like a I don't know, the domestic, or the enemy, or the domestic terrorist of liberal people. I mean, in a sense, I think that that's what we're dealing with here. Again, when I go back to my theory of what people are trying to do is really just change laws and slide the favor to the left. That's what I see happening with these things that are being ultra focused on.
Yeah, dude, totally agree. But the other big issue, man, about with all of this that came up in Minneapolis is what happened when the protesters, speaking of talking about bad behavior, it was last Sunday, this past Sunday, or the Sunday before that, protesters entered a church, which happens to be a Ascend Network church, a church planting network we both are partners with, and we partner with and affiliate with. But this particular church, by all means, everything I've heard and read about the church, it's a gospel preaching, believing church. They are expositional preaching. They believe in plurality of pastors. And so it would look a lot like a redemption church, this particular church. And they're having their normal Sunday gathering. And I think the teaching pastor was getting up to preach, and then protesters entered the church and they disrupted services. They were yelling. The pastor, I saw an interview with him later. He said, I wasn't sure if this was an active shooter situation. and that somebody was coming in to hurt us in some way. And then out of nowhere, you see Don Lemon come up, and he's interviewing the pastor when the pastor is supposed to be having his time of sermon. So this is like, imagine if you're having church one Sunday and 50 people come into your church and they start yelling at us in the middle of us preaching our sermons. And this is what happened in this church in Minneapolis. And so, like, you've got protesters who, and Don Lemon is saying this on this interview, don't you believe in the right to assemble and free protest, and that churches should be a place where anybody can come into? Yes, we agree with all those things, but we also have the freedom of religion in the First Amendment. And part of the freedom of religion is that the state can't interfere with our freedom of religion. So you have someone, this is like so ironic, who is saying, on one hand, the First Amendment allows me to speak freely here, while violating the other side of the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. And a church cannot operate and worship the Lord freely in the midst of this kind of a situation. And it was terrible. It was an absolute terrible thing, but I loved it. The pastor, as he even shared, I watched his interview with him, and he just shares the gospel on whatever news channel he was on. And he just presents the gospel. He's like, I'm a pastor. No matter who you are or what your background is, I want you to know Jesus. And he died for your sin. And that's what I'm preaching. And we're here to worship the Lord. And that's what we're here to do. And we're here to love our city. And we have a city that's hurting and broken. And we believe the gospel is the answer to a broken city. And I just loved how he answered that question, because that is the answer. And so you have that happening, which is not at all good. But it definitely brings up some questions too, I think, about the world in which we live in, security teams, safety teams for churches. What should we do in situations like that? I think that will be more of a norm as our world gets crazier and crazier. Maybe we see more of this, not less.
Yeah, I heard some people say that the thing about the right to protest or the freedom to protest, that's on public property. And so a church is private property, and especially inside the building. So I don't think that right is extended inside, especially gatherings of worship, but really any non-public property. And so I think, they were wrong in thinking what they were doing was somehow protected by the law, and apparently that's being investigated as well. And yeah, what was Don Lemon doing there? Yeah, I've heard the whole story that he was following this group of protesters and then just watched them walk into the church. So he was like, yeah, I'm going to jump on this, and just decides to do his journalism in the middle of a church service. And then he proceeds to say that he's a Christian to the guy. And I can't believe how well that pastor did handle things in the moment. I don't know how I would have handled it, but first I would just say, Don Lemon, you are not a Christian. You are living in unrepentant sin, as 1 Corinthians 6 says. In the sin list, those who practice homosexuality will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, along with all the other sins that people practice. And so Don Lemon was just a complete hypocrite. That was comical and yet frustrating to me, because I think about it, and you said that this church was just like a normal church, and I've seen, what I've read is that, like, nobody would say they were necessarily a quote unquote political church, just a church minding their own business. And this group of people decides, they want to interrupt the worship of God to insert their ideas, and not even standing outside, but come in and infiltrate and then interrupt everything. And so I think some of the guys at our church, we were talking about this, shortly afterwards, like, we need to button down our policies and procedures. How are we going to handle this when someone comes in? Who's watching the parking lot? What do we do when someone or a group of people stands up and talks? And how are we going to protect God's people, because I do believe that there is a mandate to protect the people that are coming in to worship the Lord. But this is how far they will go. This is how far they will go to try to propagandize and push for favor in their direction when they see something that they don't like. I think that's when protesting has gone too far in this case.
It's no longer
in this
protesting,
scenario.
man. You know what I mean? Like, that's not protesting. You're now disrupting church services, and you are becoming a nuisance to society. That's different.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, protesting is good. It should be a good. It's a freedom of speech. I mean, you and I were talking about this, earlier, but like the freedom that allows us to protest, the freedom of speech. What really is freedom of speech? When you have public ground in which you can say really what you want to say. That same freedom is what protects us as evangelical Christians to preach the gospel, to stand for our views. It's the reason why it existed. The freedom of speech exists so that freedom of religion can flourish. And that's what the founding fathers had decided, and to have freedom of religion. And so freedom of speech allows that. So I'm all for anybody who wants to stand up in a public square and share their ideas is free to do that. However, that doesn't give you the right to go into private property, to disrupt church services, to be in people's homes. It's just wrong. Now, man, with all of this being said, I think that there's still a real question that is looming, and it's how do we treat those? And it's more of the church's responsibility. We talked a lot about the state and a lot about kind of on that end, but what is the church's responsibility here? I think because of the nature of the rhetoric of our country right now, it feels like, to me at least, that Christians are being forced to pick a side. Like, I've either got to be anti-ICE, or I've got to be, pro-immigration and pro-anti-immigration and pro-ICE. And like, I'm for people. I'm for the common good. I'm for the Lord. But I believe as a church, we do have a responsibility here in which we should take care of those within. When I say take care of, it's show hospitality to. I want to read a couple of verses. This is in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 33. This was to the children of Israel. Obviously, it's Old Testament law. But it says, when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The argument here that the children of Israel were supposed to follow, the law here is that they're supposed to be to treat foreigners within their land with respect, to not mistreat them, to not find ways in which they can take from them, but to treat them with kindness, to treat them with love as they would treat the native in their land. Now, obviously, Old Testament law here, a lot of people would say, well, how does that apply to New Covenant Christians? Well, the Bible continues on. 1 Peter 4:9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. This word hospitality is actually hospitality to the stranger. It's not hospitality just to other believers. The word in Greek implies stranger. We also see and that we are also called exiles. First Peter calls us as Christians that we're exiles in the world today. We're still sojourning. We are part of the kingdom of heaven, and so as we enter, or a part of this kingdom of the earth, we still often feel like exiles because this world has a different worldview and a different philosophy and mindset, and so we want to take care of those within our world, our influence. You mentioned the story of the Good Samaritan. And who is our neighbor? And who should we treat with kindness and love? We think about the least of these. Jesus says, I've got people who are hungry and helpless, and those who are in prison, and those who needed clothes. And what did you do with those people? And he said, what you have done to them, you've done to me. These are the least of these. And I think that would fall under that as a church. Our job, the government has its role. I think we can say safely, yes, in government, enforce immigration, keep the peace of society. But as a church, what's our role? Anybody we come in contact with is to share the gospel first, because that's our primary mission, is to make disciples of all the nations. And then two, we should care for the least of these. And so I think it's perfectly right for a church to care for those within its community, even those who are legal or illegal. We're feeding people just because we want to help feed people. It's cold in the wintertime and we want to give jackets. We're not seeing their identification forms or I-9 forms to see whether or not they're citizens of the United States or not. We take care of whoever and everyone because we love Jesus. And as Jesus taught, we do the same. And we treat everyone with the same level of respect. Colossians chapter 3, verse 11. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. And I think our duty as Christians must be to treat everyone with the same level of respect as made in the image of God, deserving the kindness of another Christian. We can both do that, loving people well, and at the same time say, I think it's a good for us in our society that we have a government that protects its borders. I think both those things can be said, and I don't know why that seems like that's such a controversial take.
Yeah, I think it gets forgotten, but before I get to that, yeah, I agree with all that you said. I think we definitely need to be sharing the gospel with people who we come in contact with, respecting, loving our neighbor as ourselves, and Scripture and all of church history agrees that our neighbor is everyone, everyone in the world. We should love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the second or of the greatest commandments that Christ gave. Love God, love your neighbor. We've got to figure out how to do that and do that within the, I guess, the way of life that God has given us, in the country that we live in. And so abiding by the law and loving our neighbor at the same time. I've heard many different ideas about how to do that, right? Give them the cup of water, give them the food, provide for them, share the gospel, give them warmth. But then it's also okay to believe that we have an agency inside the government that also is going to do its job. Its job isn't necessarily to do our job, especially if it's not a Christian agency. But its job is to go and find the ones who did come in illegally, and probably first and foremost the ones that are a threat to our safety and security. I find security in that there are agencies, law enforcement agencies, that are doing the investigations to try to constantly keep the people inside of its borders safe first. And that almost then reminds me of this idea of how I practically think about loving our neighbor and yet being supportive of having safety and security in our borders. And it is this idea of ordered loves. It's the idea that we don't love everybody all exactly the same, and we can see that in Scripture as well. Like, you love your spouse more than you love a stranger out in the street, right? That just makes logical sense. I think there's even a command to that in Scripture. The Bible says that we're supposed to lay down our lives for our wives. There's a special intimate relationship there. So there's I love her, and then I'm going to love my kids, and then I love family, friends, and neighbors that are around in my circle, my church. I love my church. The Bible says that do good to everyone, especially to those of the household of faith. And so there is a sense in which I'm supposed to have a more focused love for the circle of people around me, and then it starts to spread out. And then as I can, love my neighbor, the sojourner. I want to quote real quick. I think it was Augustine who said this. He said, "All men are to be loved equally, but since you cannot do good to all, you are to pay special regard to those who, by the accidents of time or place or circumstance, are brought into closer connection with you." And so then, protecting those we love with a gate around our house, a lock on our door, and law enforcement in our city, our state, and even our country, and even the borders, then has to be loving in a sense. If you think about that's how you protect those who you love from the danger on the outside, then this is just in a more of a blown up, like a larger perspective way to see that we are loving those closest to us when we have good laws in the country that protect us from outside terrorists and outside criminals. And so, but yes, there are those in our country that are here and may not be a direct threat to us right at the moment, but and we can love them and care for them when we come in contact with them. But again, it's also okay to abide by the laws of the land, and I think that's how
Yeah.
a Christian should live in that framework.
Yeah, I think it's a good nuance, man. You nailed it. And I think it's that both things can be true. We can say, man, it's a legal good, a moral good that our people are protected and borders are defended. And people that want ill will on us that got here maybe in ways they shouldn't have been should be taken out of the country and removed. Or just that laws should be, taken care of. Like if I speed down the highway and, my speed, I didn't mean to hurt anybody. I didn't want to do anything wrong, but I still sped. I'm still culpable under the law. And so there is we talk about the legal framework here. And that's why I think, and just in ending this, the real question I think people probably have, maybe it's more, this is really splitting some hairs here. This may get us in the most trouble, depending on how we answer this one. But I think people really want to know morally, is what ICE is doing morally good? Is it morally wrong? Are they too aggressive? Are they not aggressive enough? Right? We have a lot of people who have a lot of different views on this. And I think this is where kind of the wisdom issues have to fall into place, where scripture doesn't give us a chapter and verse on, Hezekiah chapter 3, verse 11, when America starts, and Trump comes into power and we have, new ICE policies. This is how you should handle them as a Christian. And this is what you should stand up against. And this is what you should stand for. We don't have a chapter and verse that says that. We have the Bible giving us general principles on how we should deal with government, how we should deal with loving both our church, loving the foreigner, loving the least of these. We have commandments on those things. But I think people really want to get pressed into that one. And I'll just share my thoughts, honestly. And this is just Bobby Wood here talking. People may disagree with this, and I'm sure they do. I think by and large, especially our last presidency, we were way too open with the border. And we let a lot of bad things happen as a result of that. And I think that needs to be corrected. And I think part of what ICE is doing is attempting to correct that. I also do think, and again, I'm going to be supportive of government in every way possible. I also do think, though, there are probably good people that are probably contributing well to society that probably should be given a legal way in which to enter our country. And they did enter illegally. And maybe that was because a previous president, allowed it to happen. And they're kind of going, wait a second, I'm here now. And how I have to get taken away from family and everything else. And I wish maybe we were a little bit more lenient with some of those folks. And that's just me talking. But I do think as a whole, ICE is correcting some wrongs that were done. And that's just my opinion. How about you, man? You want to share your thoughts as we close?
Yeah, I would say that we cannot judge an entire agency or law enforcement organization based on one or two incidents. I mean, we've seen the same thing happen with just police, right? When something happens, all of a sudden it's let's defund the police because a shooting happened over here or happened over there, and that must mean the whole thing is corrupt. We can't look at isolated incidents and attribute corruption to the entire thing and just start trying to get rid of it. Is it doing good? Is it protecting? Is it providing security? Yes. Then in that case, then these isolated incidents need to be not attributed to the whole entire thing. It has a purpose. It served a purpose. It served a purpose under both parties in our country for a long time. And so that's my opinion, is I think it's a good agency, that it's doing its job. And there is a lot of controversy over the things that have happened. We need to be skeptical about those things. And look at this again, coming from the perspective of logic and a biblical worldview. That's the way I need, and I know emotions are going to be involved also in those and in our opinions about it. But let's not let this one thing tear us all apart. Really, I think there's things out there that they're a lot more dangerous than an organization internally that's meant to protect us.
Yeah, good thoughts, dude. And so again, if you're watching this, I just hope that you, whether you agree or disagree, as if you're a Christian watching this, a follower of Christ, believing in the teaching of the Bible, there's a way in which we can handle the way when we agree and disagree on things, including ones like this. And so I hope that this doesn't, even if you disagree, doesn't hurt our brotherhood in Christ and family in the nature of Christ, but that we can just, hopefully we can talk about issues in a meaningful, deep way. If you like what you heard today, you want to continue to follow us, give us a follow, like, subscribe on YouTube, and throw some questions in the comments. We would love to really dive into difficult things. If there are things you're wrestling with, things that you've wanted to hear a pastor ask questions about, but no one's ever done that before. That's kind of what we want to do. And so if it's a question that is a hard one, a difficult one, I mean, we want to attempt to wade in and offer a pastoral perspective coming from our worldview, the way we see the Bible, and hopefully it's the way the Bible presents itself. It's not just our view, but hopefully it's the biblical view. And so anyways, thanks for watching. Thanks for following. We'll see you next time.